What? Wow.
I know. Show 290, Chris. I'm so eager. I'm not depressed. I just said, all good things will come to an end someday.
Okay, Eeyore, what's on for the night? Jeez.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thank you. Oh, I skipped calling Chris Anderson in London, in Windsor. I don't know what's going on.
Chris Anderson is here in Windsor,
celebrating
Arsenal's victory and Windsor and Eaton's FC's victory.
And here in Chicago, we're celebrating the U.S. victory over Canada in overtime. It was a great moment.
Yeah,
I'm sure many of our audience were there. And we're going up against the closing ceremony, so we might lose a few people. People join us late or watch on tape delay because they're watching the closing ceremonies. But that's the way
the
it
whole
goes.
Whole
games. It's all over.
Right.
They've awarded every gold medal. So no competition next week except for basketball. Hey, welcome everybody. And hockey.
And football.
Well, not the good kind of football. Welcome everybody
to
History
Wally,
Happy Hour.
You? And Frank and Xavier, it's good to see you.
Wow, you're already getting in to say hello to people. I don't even know what
cutting up because you're being so mean to me.
Okay, welcome everyone to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Torres for bringing us on. We're going to be talking about Sherman's March today and its impact on emancipation. And look, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, whatever. On the podcast. Yeah. Welcome everybody. And Chris, we should thank all our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf supporters. Yeah. There is more room here. Believe it or not, the magic of graphics is such that we could add your name. If you want to become a top shelf patron, and you can join us at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Let us know what you're drinking. And Chris, you already started. I speeded up so you could continue, but
no, now it's your turn.
Who's out there?
Now it's your turn.
I
already read a bunch of names. Ken's joining us from Kansas, and Carolyn from
Kadeki, Kay, Sandra Jackson, Bryson Jones. You have a lot of names, Sandra. Marie Beasley is from snowy PA, and there's going to be a lot of snowy places because they're expecting 2 feet of snow in New York and Boston and Providence.
That's what my mom said.
Yeah. So, and Doreen, of course, is here, and so. We welcome all of you. So, Chris, I'm sure that Ben is probably wondering when we're going to get to him. So why don't we start this puppy?
Good bell ringing.
Good. In 1864, General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, commenced his march across Georgia. By the time he reached Savannah, something like 20,000 enslaved people had attached themselves to his army. Our guest, Bennett Parten, has written a new book examining the emancipation aspects of Sherman's March, Somewhere Towards Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. And Ben is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University with an expertise in the Civil War period. He got a PhD from Yale, and I believe I'm correct in saying this book began as his PhD dissertation. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Civil War Monitor, among others. He currently lives in Savannah, Georgia. Welcome, Ben, to History Happy Hour.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Good.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. And I'm not sure, what are you drinking today, Ben?
Well, I actually am just drinking some water.
All right. Someone has to stay sober here.
Yeah, that's right. I meant to get up and get a seltzer from the fridge, but we had too much fun chatting beforehand.
Yeah, there you go. And Chris, do you have a glass of scotch there?
Falkirk.
Okay, great. I'm drinking some red wine. So
wow, you're branching out.
Yeah, a little bit different. Ben, on the last page of your book, and I want to confirm that I read every other page before I got there. You write, Sherman's March to the Sea was a landmark moment in the history of American freedom. So I think it's fair to say this is not the standard view of Sherman's March, maybe especially from somebody who lives in Savannah. So explain what you're talking about there.
Yeah, sure. So the traditional way, right, that we've often thought about Sherman's March is as purely a military event. We've often thought, or at least debated, whether or not Sherman's tactics in Georgia previewed maybe total war, the kind of warfare we'd see later in the 20th century. And this has been the debate that has taken up much of the air out of the conversation around Sherman's March. But we also have to recognize that this was a movement at the end of the Civil War, a movement through Georgia, which was a southern state with a large population of enslaved people. And for enslaved people, this was much more than a military event. For them, it was a liberation movement. And we can understand this in part by the fact that throughout Georgia, or as the Army moved through Georgia, I should say, maybe as many as 20,000 refugees from slavery, that is, enslaved people who leave their plantations and then run to the Army and then follow the Army. About 20,000 arrived with Sherman's army outside of Savannah. And so the argument that my book makes is that this story of the refugees, of their movement, is not only the largest emancipation event in American history, but it is a central key way that we should begin to rethink and re-understand what Sherman's March was about. So what the book does that's new or novel is it puts the refugees, it puts the destruction of slavery, it puts emancipation right in the center of the story of Sherman's March.
So Ben, what I think Sherman's March is one of those events that people think they know a lot about, and they certainly have a narrative in their head about what went on. But why don't you set the stage for us in 1864? What's the situation? What is Sherman's idea? Why is this radical? I mean, kind of origin story, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So Sherman's March begins in November of 1864, and this is the last full year of the Civil War. There's some belief that maybe it will be the last full year, though there's still a lot to have happen before Appomattox in 1865. And in November of 1864 in Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army is pinned down at the railroad crossing known as Petersburg by Grant's army. And in Georgia, Sherman has just taken Atlanta, which is a major strategic victory for the Union Army or the U.S. Army. It's also a major political victory for Lincoln. Famously, he basically sails to re-election in November after Atlanta falls earlier in September. And so Sherman's March is the campaign that comes after the victory over Atlanta. It's a march of about 60,000 soldiers over about 250 miles. It takes about a month and a half. And what is so significant about the march and what has kind of lodged itself in our collective memory of the march is that it comes after the famous burning of Atlanta. And then two, part of Sherman's strategy in making this movement was that he had to cut loose of his supply lines in Atlanta, and he instructed his men to forage off the farms and fields of middle and central Georgia, both to sustain his army at the basic level, but also because he was very clear that he wanted his men to target the emotional, psychological, and material wherewithal of Southerners to continue keeping up the fight. And this is in part where this comparison or this idea of total war comes in. But if you want to leave that out of it for a moment, when we think about the burning of Atlanta and then the tactics here in Georgia, Sherman's March has historically been one of these moments that really demonstrates just how hard, how harsh, and how brutal the war had become, especially for a war that in its beginnings, many people believed would last maybe a summer, 3 months, big battle, it'd be over. And here in Sherman's March at the end of 1864, we've seen a kind of culmination of the ratcheting up of just the scale and intensity of the conflict.
So, Rick, can I just
yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Is the idea, though, of kind of bringing the suffering home, I guess you'd say, is that kind of unique to Sherman? Is this like a kind of a radically different departure, or is it an evolution of where the war has been going anyway?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think you can answer it any number of different ways. I mean, it is true that Sherman was a kind of early canary in the coal mine saying the war has to get harsher. The war has to get tougher. He had lived in the South. He had trained eventual Southern soldiers when before the war, when he was serving as a military commandant at what becomes LSU. So he sort of knew right early on that the war was going to have to get tougher. less restrained in order for the U.S. to win. And so part of this is Sherman and his own kind of thinking and his own background. Very famously, famously for me at least, he's the military governor of Memphis in 1862. And Memphis turns out to be a town full of recalcitrant Confederates who resist. They fire on his men. He has to deal with Confederate guerrillas. And he writes back to Grant basically saying, like, we've got to use a much heavier hand in this war. And so we can see Sherman's own evolution going back to then. But at the same time, this is something that I think more and more people are becoming aware of. And certainly for him, Sherman, that is, and Grant as a duo, this is something they become aware of, after Shiloh in 1862. And so, yes, it's partly, who Sherman is. It's partly his own evolution, his own kind of way of understanding warfare. But there are a number of people in the U.S. Army who are also having that similar evolution, just because that's the way the war is evolving.
Yeah.
Well, as long as we're talking about Sherman, let's ask, as we're setting this up, as he's beginning this march, what are his views on slavery? There are Union generals who are tremendous abolitionists. There are Union generals who, like McClellan, who really want to try to work out an agreement where everybody can hold on to their slaves. He's not really interested in abolition at all. Where do his feelings fall on this, spectrum?
Yeah, well, let me preface this by saying I'm actually working on a biography of Sherman right now, so I'm a little bit
bingo,
closer.
Your second appearance on History Happy Hour.
Well,
we can confirm that now.
Oh, all right. So I'm a little bit closer to this than maybe sometimes I wish I was. But he is definitely someone who, when the war begins, he sees slavery as having nothing to do with it. For Sherman, this is a war about the nation's integrity and nothing else. And in fact, before the war begins, as I said, he's serving as a military commandant at a university that goes on to become LSU. This is a real plum job for him after really kind of struggling to find a career after the Army. He tries banking, it doesn't work. He starts banking in San Francisco when the gold rush, the bottom's falling out rather than when the rush is happening. And he's really desperate. And so he gets this job in Louisiana, and this really shapes his own perceptions of slavery. He writes back to his brother-in-law where he says, quote, "My views on slavery are good enough for this country being not the U.S., but the South." He's writing his brother, who is in Congress as a congressman. He later becomes a senator, basically saying, hey, I don't want you people to think that you're too anti-slavery because it'll make me look bad here in Louisiana. He even writes his brother speculating that him and his wife may actually purchase an enslaved person to serve as a domestic servant in their home when he's in Louisiana. And so when the war begins, he's really conflicted because he doesn't want to leave Louisiana. He doesn't really see slavery as an issue that's worth basically all the fuss over. But he ultimately does resign from his position and move back to Ohio and then eventually get into the Army. And this is just a little bit of a sampling of kind of where his views are for the early part of the war. When the U.S. begins embracing emancipation in 1862, he resisted. Again, he's writing back to his brother, who's a Republican senator, saying things like, freedom is just an abstraction. It's going to make our work for the Army harder. He does very little to actually enforce emancipation. He has a lot of qualifications around basically how he will enforce it and what he'll do with enslaved people who come to his army. And he basically keeps this position throughout the war. That said, by the time that Sherman's march begins, he has evolved, even if ever so slightly. And what I mean by that is that now he's come to understand that a way to win this war as quickly as possible is to target slavery. And so where he once didn't see emancipation as having anything to do with this war, now he sees it as a tool to bring it to a close. And he also realizes, and this is interesting for Sherman because he's someone who hated politics and didn't think politically, but he has been told and made aware that styling himself as a liberator is good for him politically, that it silences his critics. And so he sometimes likes to play up the fact that he is one of the great liberators of the Civil War. which is really ironic because he's someone who didn't really, go into it believing himself or wanting to do that. But he nonetheless, by the end of 1864, thinks it's good for him to sort of cast himself as such.
Well, one of the things that really surprised me when I was reading the book, and then I thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, but you say that there's almost no real consideration of we're going to be marching deep into the heart of the South, where there happen to be a lot of enslaved people that we might encounter. So what are we going to do about them? And
Yeah.
at least in reading, and so I mean, I want to get back to that, but what has sort of been sort of the state of the evolution of that question of freedmen?
Yeah.
I mean, because I know we've had Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation, we've had the Port Royal experiment, which I'm sure we're going to get into. So people are starting to deal with this. Where are we at?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. And for the audience, one of the things we have to understand is that from the moment the war begins, enslaved people begin running to the army, and enslaved people run to the army from the moment the war begins to even after it's over. And the way that emancipation evolves and unfolds is really as a kind of push and pull of enslaved people running to the army, fleeing to the army, forcing the army and the U.S. government to take note of them, and then craft legislation to respond to them. And then in doing so, they basically open up more possibilities for enslaved people to flee to the army. And so it's always this kind of back and forth push and pull that eventually gets us to the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's really important. And that's in part why Sherman's March becomes the phenomenon that it does, is because not only is Georgia the largest slave state that hadn't really been invaded that deeply just yet, but also because at this point it's well over a year after the Emancipation Proclamation. People assume the war is coming to a close, and so enslaved people, when they hear that the army is coming, they are more convinced than ever that those armies are armies of liberation, whether or not Sherman really defines his army as such or not. At this point, enslaved people need no convincing that if they can get to the army, they can find freedom or something like it. And so it's this confluence of different ingredients, of different factors, that has a lot to do with timing, and also just the fact that there's so many enslaved people in Georgia's interior that really set this up to become a major emancipation event.
So slaves started attaching themselves to Sherman's army. And how does that, like, what would that look like if we were there? How, give us some detail. How does that work? Do they just walk up and start marching with soldiers? What's going on?
Well, it's a really good question. It brings me to a point that I should have mentioned in my last answer, which is that, again, as I said, enslaved people always move to meet the army. And what's really unique in places like in Memphis, or when the army's around Vicksburg and Mississippi, when the army's in Arkansas and Tennessee and Nashville, the army's usually stationary, right? The campaigns are a little bit longer. I mean, to take Vicksburg takes a long time. And what historians have uncovered is that, usually beside army camps, there are always auxiliary refugee camps of enslaved people who run to the army. Many of the men find work for the army as laborers, and they build sometimes temporary, sometimes more permanent, essentially refugee camps. And so that happens throughout the war. And what emancipation actually looks like, what freedom actually looks like, is this kind of negotiation between what the army will allow, what the government tells the army to do, and then what enslaved people basically accept or don't accept, and what they keep sort of pressing the army to allow them to do. And so it's a really complicated story that looks different throughout the Civil War. But what is unique about Sherman's March is the fact that Sherman, that is, left his supply base in Atlanta and had to move. And so this march covers 250 miles over a very short amount of time, and movement to it was key. And so enslaved people had no ability to build these temporary camps because the army wasn't really setting up permanent camps. They were on the move day after day, marching 15 miles at a time. And so for enslaved people, for them, it was literally just getting to the army, whatever way they could. And usually what happened is that men, especially if men were in, good health, if they could, sort of fend for themselves, if they could work for the army, they would sometimes be allowed to travel along with the army and get inclusion that way. But Sherman often didn't do the same for women and children who he believed were dependents. And so basically the way that this worked was that women, children, and the elderly basically just fell in behind the army. And so as the army is moving through Georgia, you have these long lines of soldiers. You have the foraging parties that are spreading out about 30 miles wide from the four main columns. And then you have long lines and trains of enslaved people who are walking on foot, who are in carriages, and who are doing their best to basically keep up in the army's wake.
But Ben, they're not just marching behind; they're active participants, and you talk about that quite a bit. And I'd like you to kind of get into some of the roles that they play to actively support this operation. Would the march have looked the way that it did without them? Would it have succeeded? And you had an interesting reference to a historian, Stephanie Camp, and she talks about rival geography. So yeah, maybe you could tie some of that kind of into the answer.
Sure, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, they're doing much more than just marching behind the army. They are doing a number of different roles that are really critical to the Army's success. And I should say that for many soldiers, this is one of the things that's so phenomenal about this moment. They're engaging and interacting with enslaved people like never before. And they are all very aware that enslaved people are always their allies, that they're always their friends. And they could always turn to them for help if they need it. And a couple great examples of that is that when the foraging parties went out to forage, oftentimes white families would hide their valuables. They'd put things in a trunk and bury it in the family cemetery. They would bury horses out in a corral in the woods. But of course, I say they wouldn't actually do it. It was actually enslaved people they forced to do it. And so when Sherman's army arrived on the plantations, the enslaved people would say, "Great, everything's buried right there."
They would say, about his fair play, right?
Yeah, they'd say, "I can take you directly to these horses." And sometimes they would actually use the knowledge of these things to barter, to say, "I will show you where you can find about 30 prized horses and cows that you can take along with you if you let me and my family come along with you as well." They were intelligence scouts. They led soldiers down footpaths to avoid cavalry. Sherman always asked for enslaved people to know the lay of the land and to get a read on the situation. Another great story is that as the left wing near Savannah, the farms there are less abundant. The traveling is slower. There are real worries that maybe the march might be unsuccessful, that maybe these foraging parties might return empty-handed, and they might have. But for about 3 days, enslaved people on those plantations just north of Savannah, in what is the rice plantations north of Savannah, basically teach Sherman's army of Midwesterners how to eat rice, how to put beans in it to make it good, right? How to season it, how to use a mortar and pestle to husk and to hull it, and really sustain the soldiers. And so
they're helping also, right? They're also helping people who've been taken prisoners by the Confederate forces who are kind of much smaller than Sherman's force, but harassing him from the sides.
Yeah, there are great stories of prisoners who returned to Sherman's army from Columbia, from Augusta. There's a prison in Millen, which is just south of Augusta, where soldiers escape from, and they run into enslaved people. And enslaved people say, "Let me help you." And there are stories of, for weeks, that these enslaved people basically harbor them. They give them safe haven. They help lead them to where the army is while they travel at night. And this is something that leaves a huge impression on the soldiers, because usually the soldier who has escaped, the POW, will arrive back to the army looking, like he'd been a captive, with the enslaved person or enslaved people, and say, "I'm only here because of them. You should give them access to the army. You should make sure they come along, and they should have everything that we have in terms of to eat and all that sort of stuff." And so that's one of the great examples of just how crucial they were to the well-being of the army, and how it really left a deep impression on many of Sherman's men. And this gets back, Chris, to your point about Stephanie Camp, the historian who wrote a little bit about the idea of rival geographies. And the whole idea there is that much of the system and structure of slavery as an institution really hinged on curtailing movement, of using geography and surveillance to make sure that enslaved people did not flee or run away. And so there was this real system of containment. But enslaved people throughout the history of slavery, in what we think of as slave politics or slave resistance, often found ways of using geography and creating space, rival geographies, on a plantation or elsewhere to try to combat and undermine these systems of surveillance and control. Maybe this is a secret meeting place out in the woods. Maybe it's a set of footpaths in the woods that enslaved people can get to and from one plantation to the next. Maybe it's networks of communication, whether it's at a market or between carriage drivers that share news and politics of the war from one place to the next. But enslaved people built these networks in the period of slavery. And the point that Camp makes, and the point that I also try to build on and make as well, that I think is totally true, which is that this foundation of resistance, these networks that are built in slavery, when the war begins, they basically burst open and become even more important. And enslaved people utilize these rival geographies, these networks they've created, these means of resisting slavery. And this becomes, for many of them, the pathways that lead to freedom. They call on these sort of deep histories, deep knowledge of the landscape to get to Sherman's army, to flee a plantation. And they really call on them to utilize these spaces in their pursuit of freedom.
So there's a turning point of sorts. I'm not sure that's the correct phrase, but there's a change that takes place at a place called Ebenezer Creek.
Yeah.
And it involves a Union general, I'll throw him up here, with the unusual name of Jefferson Davis, which is the same name as the president of the Confederacy. This is Jefferson Columbus Davis. I guess that's how we would distinguish him. So what happens at Ebenezer Creek? And there's a bunch of questions that are going to come off of this, because I feel like this is sort of the gateway to all that happens after that. But what's the immediate impact of that on Sherman's reputation as news of that goes north?
Yeah. Well, as I said, for many soldiers, their interactions with enslaved people are enormously positive, and it leads them to really think critically about what this war is about. Many of them begin to see enslaved people as people worth fighting for because of the way that they have allied with the army, but not everyone. And Davis is the sterling example of a soldier who goes in the opposite direction and basically digs in his heels on this issue. And Davis is someone who has a reputation for being a villain. He'd actually murdered a fellow officer in cold blood back in 1862. He is someone who had a reputation.
Go ahead and tell us about that.
Okay.
This is
it's a great
Bull
story.
Nelson, right? So
Bull Nelson, who is Davis's superior. And this takes place in Louisville, which is actually not too far from where Davis is from. Davis is from southern Indiana. And anyway, he is in Louisville. He is serving under Nelson, and the two get into some sort of spat. It's believed that Nelson doesn't think very much about Davis's abilities as a soldier. They get into an argument, and at one point, Nelson takes a wad of paper, flips it in his face, and says, "Go away, you damned puppy." Which, in the 19th century, I guess, is as good an insult as you can give to someone.
I know, damned puppy. I'm definitely not going to use that.
Yeah,
Chris, I'm not calling you that in any way.
I will throw my cricket ball at you.
Oh my God. Okay.
But this sets off Davis. He marches the streets. He finds a handgun.
Borrows a pistol.
Borrows a pistol.
He goes up to somebody and says, I need a pistol. What for? I just have a need right now for a pistol. Yeah.
Well, he walks right up to Nelson, and presumably as Nelson's getting up from his desk, he shoots him dead, kills him right there on the spot. And Davis gets off because the army's at war. They need experienced soldiers. So Davis never sees trial. He's never punished really for killing Nelson. But no one forgets. This is part of his reputation. People know that he has done this, that he's a rogue. They also know too that he is from southern Indiana, right across the river from slaveholding Kentucky. He's an old kind of pro-slavery Democrat. He's not anything close to an abolitionist, which most soldiers, you know, were as well. But still, Davis is someone who really, right, resists this embrace of emancipation. And he nonetheless arrives at Sherman's army during the Atlanta campaign. He serves well, gets a promotion. And during the March to the Sea, he's one of Sherman's corps commanders. And he is in charge of the farthest left column. Because when Sherman moved out of Atlanta, he split his army into 2 wings. Oh, yeah, there's the great map. Within each wing, there were 2 columns. So there's effectively 4 columns. And then there's a cavalry unit that's kind of floating that covers a lot more ground than the 4 infantry columns. But Davis's wing is the farthest left. And this matters because it means that his route is going to take him closest to the Savannah River. Which means he's going to cross all those tributaries, all those streams, all those blackwater swamps that are close to the Savannah River, especially in its northern reaches. And Davis is also someone who is the only corps commander that I can find who wrote back to Sherman expressing his displeasure at the fact that so many refugees are following his army. We don't know what Sherman says in response. I haven't found any letter. But we do know that Davis basically takes matters into his own hand by essentially pulling up temporary bridges, like these pontoon bridges, right? This is an approximation of what these bridges would be like. Whenever the army came to a river, they would set down these pontoon bridges so they could get across. And before the refugees could follow along as well, they would pull these bridges up and essentially block them from crossing. And he does this a few times, but then disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek. And I just want to preface this for folks listening. It's called Ebenezer Creek, but if you've ever lived or traveled right down to the Low Country, or lived next to the coast, you know what these bodies of water are like. These are really more like a bayou or a blackwater swamp. The water level's high. The crossing is close to the Savannah River, so the current would have been very swift. That time of year in December, we usually get a lot of rain here in Savannah, so the water level would have been higher. The swamp would have been, the water would have been much deeper. So it's a little bit more than a creek, right? It's a little bit more than a stream. It's a much bigger body of water. But disaster strikes here because as the bridges go up, and there's some sources suggest that Davis burned the bridges, Confederate cavalry barrel into the refugees that are stranded on the bank. And they force many into the water, from which many did not return from. And then those who are left standing on the bank are either captured and killed, or captured and re-enslaved. And so Ebenezer Creek becomes by far the bleakest, most tragic, darkest, most haunting moment in this entire story. And it becomes a real turning point because, again, for many of the soldiers, they realize just the lengths that enslaved people will go to pursue freedom. For enslaved people, it's a turning point because they can't go back now, right? They can't recross the creek, those that have made it to the other side. And it becomes a real turning point because Sherman kind of has to answer for this when he takes Savannah. It doesn't get to near the levels of, praise that he gets for taking the city, but there is, whispers, there's conversations happening back in DC that want answers to what happened at Ebenezer Creek. Why did Sherman let this take place? And so he does have to actually kind of answer for what his army did as it relates to emancipation along the march to Savannah.
Yeah, so Ben, I kind of want to pick up on that a bit. Many years ago, I lived in Harper's Ferry. I was a big Army of the Potomac guy, the Eastern Theater, and I knew about all the abolitionists from Massachusetts and all that sort of thing. And it's probably wrong, but I just don't have this perception of Sherman and the Western Federal armies kind of having that same sort of aura. But you write in the book, as these Union soldiers are marching deep into the South and they're actually confronting slavery, saying what this means, that it really affects these guys. And
yeah,
that kind of runs through the whole book. You talk about it at Ebenezer Creek, but how is this march changing perceptions of these soldiers and everybody really?
Yeah, it's hugely important. And you're absolutely right. Demographically, this is a much different army than the Army of the Potomac. Sherman's army is mostly a Midwestern army. soldiers from Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. There, to my knowledge, not a single New York regiment. There could be. There's only one or two Massachusetts regiments, maybe a couple Pennsylvania regiments, but it's predominantly a Midwestern Western Army. And many of these folks are farmers, right? They're not necessarily urbanites. Many of them actually are recent immigrants. There are a number of German speakers that are in Sherman's army. And with all due respect to the Army of the Potomac, these are very proud, sort of hardened soldiers as well. I mean, these are people who have done some really hard fighting in places like Atlanta and Vicksburg. They've covered a lot of ground. And many of them have encountered slavery at various moments in the war, likely. But this is really the time when they begin to see slavery as up close and personal than they ever have before. And for many of them, it's really their first encounter with enslaved people. And so the way that enslaved people ally with the Army, sites like Ebenezer Creek, this is hugely important for them when it comes to sort of conceptualizing just what the war is about and the place that enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, now freed people, might have in a future U.S. As I said, that's not something that is universally shared. These are still folks that have their own prejudices, and that is not done away with easily. But it becomes a real experience for many of these soldiers, and it's something that makes this march unique for them. And we know that because they write about it after the war when they write their memoirs and their regimental histories.
Yeah.
So when the Army reaches Savannah, I'm going to change the view here. When the Army reaches Savannah, we all have to stay in the middle. I think that's the point at which most histories of Sherman march kind of end the story. Sherman reaches Savannah. He sends Lincoln a telegram saying, "I'm making it a Christmas present to you." Sherman's march is over. He's demonstrated that the South has lost, and then he'll come north and join with Grant and defeat Sherman. But your book starts to, for me, it got really interesting at this point because there was stuff that I didn't know. When he arrives at Savannah, the Secretary of War Stanton shows up, who will later become sort of Sherman's arch enemy. But this leads to this extraordinary meeting with African American ministers. I think 19 of them, which blew me away that there could be 19 African American ministers in Savannah. And it seems to happen partly because of Stanton's unease with Sherman's reputation after Ebenezer Creek. So tell us about this meeting and what happens.
Yeah, it's an amazing meeting, and it's part of the story that I think is so important.
And so left out of so many accounts.
Yeah, exactly. So you're absolutely right. Stanton comes to Savannah after New Year's, after Savannah officially falls. He's there primarily he says that his purpose is to requisition the cotton that's left over in the city. He does do that. But Sherman, even in his memoirs, he's very clear that Stanton has an ulterior motive, which is to ask him about emancipation and about what happened at Ebenezer Creek, because word has gotten back, and as Secretary of War, he wants answers. And he wants answers because Stanton is thinking about politics. He's worried that if news leaks out, it could cause problems and politically for him and for Lincoln amongst this kind of anti-slavery press. He's also really worried that if this spreads and becomes a bigger topic of conversation, that maybe enslaved people will think twice, freed people, I should say, will think twice about enlisting in the U.S. Army. So he's worried that if the Army has a reputation of being less than forthright in pursuing emancipation, if Sherman basically allowed Ebenezer Creek to happen willingly, or if he ordered it, he's worried that this might actually dampen support amongst freed people for the United States colored troops, right? And they actually might see fewer and fewer formerly enslaved people enlisting in the Army, which is a real priority for the War Department in this moment. So anyway, Stanton calls this meeting, and it's Sherman and Stanton with one aide who transcribed the meeting. and there are the African-American ministers, some of whom are actually enslaved right up until the moment Sherman walks in the city. So that's just an amazing sort of thing, right? That you have these two incredibly powerful people who are talking to people who have such a role in the community, but some of whom were actually just enslaved a few days before. I mean, that's an amazing sort of thing to think about.
Well,
And the ministers appoint a man named Garrison Frazier, who is himself a pastor. He's someone who had bought his freedom 10 years before and bought his wife's freedom. And they hold this amazing conversation. It's sometimes referred to as the Savannah colloquy, where Stanton, this trained lawyer, this nationally respected railroad attorney, begins peppering Frazier with questions. And the topic of conversation is what to do with the Georgia freedmen, meaning all those refugees. But Stanton kind of begins asking questions like, define slavery, which for Stanton to ask a formerly enslaved person to define slavery is such an interesting and in some respects almost disrespectful sort of question to ask. But Frazier just sort of spits it back with the most sort of eloquent, concise definition imaginable. Stanton begins asking him, well, how do you define freedom? And Frazier just sort of answers it. And again, the most sort of eloquent, concise way imaginable. And ultimately what happens is that this conversation about the Georgia freedmen becomes a much larger conversation about the meaning of the Civil War and what freedom might bring. Because what Frazier does is he outlines a vision of freedom that is predicated on land ownership. He tells Sherman and Stanton that what the best thing that freed people, or the best thing to do for freed people, the best thing that freed people can receive is land, that would give them the independence they need going forward into the post-war period. They want to be put in a position where they can either be placed on land and then be able to purchase land for themselves. And this is why a few days later, Sherman issues his famous Special Field Orders 15, which will go on to transform the scope of the possible when it comes to Reconstruction by putting land reform on the table. Special Field Orders 15 sets aside requisition plantations from Charleston in the north all the way to Jacksonville for exclusively African-American homesteading. And Sherman's doing this for his own self-interest. He wants the refugees away from his lines. He wants them there on the islands and not following his army. But in giving this orders, he essentially lets the genie out of the bottle. And whether he realized it or not, he suddenly made the politics of the post-war period become so much more potentially transformative because now real land reform is on the table and will become a topic of conversation as Washington is debating Reconstruction policy. But if I can just say one more thing about that meeting, the most important moment, I think, for me is this almost throwaway line in the transcript. But it's one of those moments that as historians, you read it and you're like, your hair stands up on the back of your neck. And it goes a long way, I think, in explaining the kind of story I try to tell in the book. And this moment where Stanton, again, this experienced lawyer, he looks at Frazier and he says, well, how have you come by your opinions? Meaning essentially what gives you the authority to speak on behalf of so many people? And Frazier looks at him and he says, well, I've come by my opinions in the course of my ministry, right? He's a pastor. And in my conversation with the many freed people who have come to Savannah behind Sherman's army, whose numbers surpass even my own expectation. Not only is this an amazing admission of him, basically saying that this movement is far larger than even he could have imagined, but it suggests that the refugees found a place to, or found a way to have a presence in this meeting. That despite not physically being there, through incredible courage, through enduring this hardship, through collective action, they nonetheless found a way to get to the army, to follow the army, to have these conversations with Frazier, to share their political aspirations with him, who then shared them with Sherman and Stanton, these two incredibly powerful men, who then put these aspirations into real policy through the Special Field Orders 15, which is going to go on to completely reshape what Reconstruction can look like. And so this is always such an important moment for me because it demonstrates just the way that people who have traditionally been faceless or nameless to history, people who have been written out of history, forgotten by history, nonetheless, through their own courage and collective action, found a way to do something extraordinary and go on to have a real impact on the shape and the nature of history nonetheless. So it's a really kind of powerful moment where we see just what average, ordinary people can do when they, decide to move and decide to act collectively like this.
Well, we're going to pretty soon, Ben, we're going to get to the point where we're like, we've run out of time and there's so much more we want to talk about. So preface by saying that, but I want to pick up on what you just said, because one of the things that's so important about your book is, for most of us, Sherman's March to the Sea is the armies, they're burning down cities, they're taking out a plant, and you start to shift that focus to the freedmen coming and joining the army. And we've talked a little bit about how, they're assisting in that process. We've just talked about this meeting, but they're central actors to all this. I think even in our questions, we kind of fall into this trap of, we talk about Sherman and we talk about Stanton and we talk about all these people, but we forget about the central players, which are the freedmen.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a little bit more about sort of their reaction to their march and how, as much as they can in their realm, how they're sort of trying to drive the agenda and say, look, we're the people that have suffered and this is what we need.
Yeah.
So how are they trying to steer that?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just to kind of demonstrate just how important they are. Maybe I'll just start by placing this 20,000 number in comparison. I mean, 20,000 refugees. That is double the size of Atlanta in 1860. It is roughly the size of Savannah in 1860, which is Georgia's largest state and one of the largest city and one of the largest cities in the South. And that's a third of Sherman's overall army. So this is a massive, massive movement of people. And these 20,000 people marching alongside an army of 60,000, that's a massive movement of people through the state of Georgia. And so, of course, the aftermath of this movement would have real implications for what would come right after the end of the campaign, right, and in the aftermath. But if I could just say that 20,000 number alone doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the army and then were turned back by the army, which did happen, especially as the army came close to Savannah. It doesn't take into account the people who might have marched halfway and then turned back on their own volition. It doesn't take into account the people who just simply experienced freedom as a consequence of this movement. And so just in terms of size and scale, it's impossible to really get our mind around just how big of an event this was for enslaved people. And you're absolutely right. They do a number of different things to demonstrate to the army just how central they are to this story. I've already talked a little bit about some of the ways that they ally with the army. But what's really interesting, too, is that as they run to the army, many of the soldiers begin to sort of think a little bit about what slavery and freedom mean just in their conversations with enslaved people about why they're moving. It becomes clear for us that for many of them, as they are beginning to define what freedom means for them in this moment, part of it is family. Many of them run to the army and fall along the army because it's a way to either reunite with family, it's a way to keep family together. And many of them move in the hopes of finding folks that have been lost to them. Many of them move just simply because the freedom to move is a constituent element of freedom, right? That for the first time ever, they have the ability to use their feet and go wherever they want, right? And many of them follow the army because for them, security is freedom. And following the army gives them a sense of security that they haven't had previously. And so not only are they placing themselves at the center of this movement by helping the soldiers, but they're also telling the soldiers what it means to them to be able to move. And they're beginning to build a world for themselves in freedom by just putting the basic building blocks of whatever we might think freedom is together and acting on it. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing. And that's one reason why I think I have a moment in the book where I try to say that, we should really think about this moment as one of these kind of landmark moments in the history of American freedom. Because yes, it maybe doesn't look like constitutional thinking the way that we think of, the Philadelphia in 1776 or later when the Constitution is being written. It's not Lincoln at Gettysburg, but these are large numbers of people who are nonetheless imagining freedom and acting on freedom as never before and envisioning it. And so I like to say, the Sherman's March has long been grouped in with Shiloh and all these other Civil War battles. But I think the better conversation to put it in is that, alongside a moment like Selma, Alabama, in 1965, Lincoln at Gettysburg, Yorktown, right? One of these kind of landmark moments in how we often define and tell the history of American freedom.
Well, we're getting short on time, so we're skipping through a bunch of stuff. And you mentioned
Buy the
Sherman's.
book and you can read about
Right,
all of this
exactly.
stuff.
And we should remind people that the book is called Somewhere Toward Freedom. So if you needed to leave the show early, you can still go buy it now. And we've mentioned Sherman's Special Order 15, which is the famous 40 acres and a mule order. We've talked about the issue of land that is so important in this. We haven't even gotten into how sincere Sherman is, or whether he's just posturing to be able to move his army on. But I want to change the topic because we're short on time and ask you to tell us about the Port Royal experiment, which you devote some time to in the book. And this is an amazing story, which quite frankly doesn't get covered at all in many major Civil War works. And I specifically went back. I always love Shelby Foote. I feel like Shelby Foote covers everything. Bruce Catton covers everything. Not in either of those books. They've got nothing on this. And yet it seems so important. So tell us a little bit about it, and then people can learn more about it by buying the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I think too few people know about the Port Royal experiment, but it's so important. And I was fortunate because not only was I born and raised in Georgia, so the Sherman's March history was very present for me growing up, but I also spent a lot of time in the Low Country around Port Royal. So the Port Royal experiment history was also very present for me. I was very aware of it. And only when I was writing the book did I realize that these two things are connected. And they're connected because, well, Port Royal has such a unique history. The Port Royal experiment really begins in earnest early in the war in 1861. And it's because Port Royal Sound, which is just north of Savannah, is the deepest deepwater port on the southern coastline. And so the U.S. Navy lands in Port Royal Sound. They take Port Royal Sound, because from there they could then begin blockading both Charleston and Savannah. And when the Navy sails into Port Royal Sound and they establish a depot and a port there, the region's white inhabitants all flee. These are some of the wealthiest, largest slaveholders in the area on the Sea Islands. Beaufort was a kind of plantation town, which is Beaufort's right next to Port Royal. It was a kind of resort town for a lot of the largest slaveholders in the South. And it leaves behind about 10,000 enslaved people. And for all intents and purposes, these are people that are free, but this is still early in 1861. We've got a long way to go to get to the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what is decided, and this has a lot to do with Edwin Stanton, who is Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, he establishes a program where teachers, philanthropists, humanitarians, bureaucrats, technocrats, they all come to the islands. They administer aid to the 10,000 freed people. They build schools. They start hosting religious services. There's great stories about how that they do wedding ceremonies for the first time for enslaved people. But they also, and this is the critical part, they force, coerce, convince enslaved people to go back working in the cotton fields, not as slave laborers, but as free wage laborers. And so the entire idea of the Port Royal experiment is that it's going to be a kind of early moment that begins to segue and ease this transition from slavery to freedom. And it's got a long, complicated history. And there's been a couple good books about it. I talk about this history in my own book. But this matters because as Sherman is marching through Georgia, when he arrives on the coast, he thinks that this is the better place for the refugees than the rear of his army. And so he begins a process around Christmas of shipping the refugees out into the Atlantic and over to the South Carolina Sea Islands. And yes, there's my handy dandy homemade
well
Google
done.
map.
Well done on the
Thank you. Thank you. You'll see the river that's so important is not the Savannah, which has been disrupted and disturbed, but the Ogeechee River, which is near this town of Richmond Hill. The Ogeechee River becomes the Army's main depot and lifeline to the Atlantic and the U.S. Navy offshore. But Sherman begins loading the refugees up onto boats and shipping them to Port Royal, and that kind of island community there around Port Royal and Beaufort. And Sherman thinks this is a great thing because there's support and an infrastructure of help there for the refugees. This actually becomes a really terrible decision because eventually there'll be a lack of food on the islands. There's so many refugees that are arriving in a place that really doesn't have the structures in terms of places for them to stay, right? The shelter. And eventually Port Royal becomes the kind of epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis. So this refugee movement behind Sherman's army really becomes a crisis when it reaches the shores of South Carolina, because there's just, well, there's all the challenges that go into, our, modern refugee stories as we understand them, right? Basic necessities, a lack of security, sickness, disease, that sort of thing. So the story really takes a tragic turn when the refugees arrive there on the islands.
Chris, if you got one more, you can go for it, or we can stop. Either way.
No, one of the things that I'd like you to maybe touch on, that's so impressive in your book, is you give voice to these people who have really not appeared in many histories, as Rick and we all talked about. How did you recover the voices of the freedmen? Was it hard?
Yeah.
What did you find? How did you tap into that?
Yeah, it was really hard. I mean, that's one of the challenges of I think of writing the book, and there's a lot of reasons why I think maybe a book like this hadn't come out before. And I think one of the challenges is just the question of sources. I mean, enslaved people historically have left few sources, I think for obvious reasons. And the refugees, right? People who are on the move leave even fewer. But I was really aided by two things. One is the fact that armies, aside from being fighting forces, are massive bureaucracies, and they leave behind just enormous amounts of paper in the form of reports, letters, you name it. And we don't always get great qualitative sources, right? Long stories of enslaved people, but they appear in these reports. And through just the preponderance of times that they appear, you can begin to kind of piece together a much larger story. Mm-hmm. And then two, Sherman's soldiers themselves. They often wrote about Sherman as if he was an American Napoleon. They often sort of wrote about their, Sherman's marches in as a kind of Napoleonic movement, which has a little bit about how they sort of saw themselves, right? And what this campaign was going to mean in American history more broadly. And so after the war, especially when they realized that publishers would pay them to write their stories, many of them do. They publish their letters, they publish their histories, they publish their memories. And again, one of the things that makes this campaign so unique is their interactions with enslaved people. Now, these are soldiers that, have the same prejudices you might imagine 19th century Americans, white Americans might have. But you can still read these sources in a certain way to sort of glean the voices and experiences of enslaved people. And when we listen and read the sources, for those voices, you can often learn a great deal. And again, just through the preponderance of voices that you hear, you can begin to piece together and tell a much larger story.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to mention that your book is called Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of Largest Emancipation. Chris and I often talk about what we like in books that come our way. And one of the things we both like is when we learn stuff we didn't know before. And there's a lot of stuff in this book that was a learning experience for me. And I don't know about you, Chris.
Absolutely.
But yeah. So definitely recommend this book as one to pick up and buy. And it's 209 pages before you get to the acknowledgments. So
it's not the 1942 book that's coming.
Right. It's not the 1,000-page 1942 book that we thank goodness we have a few encore episodes before that, so we'll have time to read it. Although then we have to carry it around with us for week after week. But sorry to submit you that, Ben. But Ben Parten, thank you so much for joining us for our conversation today. We so appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a blast.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, man.
Really good book.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed that. Really seriously, I know he can still hear us, but I really seriously do recommend it for everybody. Next week, Chris, we will be bringing back author Dan King. Right, who is a fluent Japanese speaker who lived in Japan. He interviewed more than 100 Japanese World War II veterans. He's written a few books. He's been on History Happy Hour twice already. But he's got a new book that's come out called The Iron Graves of Saipan, Firsthand Accounts of the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment from Manchuria to the Mariana Islands.
Yes.
So this will be his third time on the show. He is a very careful interviewer and researcher and a good writer, and I'm sure that this will be a really interesting and fascinating show.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. Dan's always a great guest, and this is a topic that I find incredibly fascinating. I'm going to be on Saipan soon, and talking about what happens to the 9th Tank Regiment on Saipan is always.
So you're gonna be sitting there like this the entire
Absolutely, taking notes,
making notes, right? Have you read the book already?
I've started it, and Dan has been teasing me for years about writing this book, so I'm so excited to kind of get the Japanese.
It's always hard when we get excited in advance, because then we could be disappointed. But
we haven't been by Dan yet.
We haven't been by Dan, so I'm rooting for Dan. I think he'll do a good job here. We've exceeded the 1 hour limit on our show, but nevertheless, let me just say, please. Thank you so much for joining us, and please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.